I would imagine most of us are fans of dogs. I've used one of our dogs as an object lesson before, and here we are going to again. I grew up with dogs. I love dogs. We've had, a pattern of having at least two dogs in our household. As it is this day, we have a German Shepherd and a mutt. I don't know what he is. He was supposed to be a Mastiff, and that didn't happen. Goofy. But our German Shepherd, I'd never really been around any German Shepherds growing up, and these are fantastic animals. When we first got her name is Hazel because she has beautiful hazel eyes. They just pop out. But when we first got her, I always love to spend some time alone with our dogs when we first get them, so that they can learn to know their master, and I can get to know them more greatly and so forth. But it wasn't long before she was quite attached to me, and it's become something fairly intriguing. It's certainly different. It's peculiar sometimes. She'll follow me everywhere, and when I stand still, she'll sit right in front of me and just stare straight up at me, just waiting for me to either command her to do something or to pet her or whatever. But she loves to follow me around. When I begin to pet her, she kind of jumps up and hugs my leg. It's adorable. But one of the other things, my wife, Sarah, I need to give her name now. I was reprimanded rightfully for never giving her name. So my wife, Sarah, and I, one of the things we love to do for leisure and so forth, to just, hang out and just enjoy each other's time. Well, we like to sit out on the patio. We love to be outside, and so we love to sit out on the patio. And one of the things Hazel loves to do is, after she runs around, she always comes around and sits right at my right side, and then leans up against my seat. Now, this always conjures up in my mind my relationship to Jesus Christ. I love the idea of following him around everywhere, and then whenever he stands still, I'm going to sit right there and stare at him, waiting for anything to take place. And then when he's sitting, leisurely or whatever the case is, I love the idea of coming to his right side and sitting at his right hand. I love the picture. Now, the reason I wanted to kind of illustrate this is because yes, my time with Hazel and so on has manifested this wonderful relationship. But essentially, if God didn't infuse in these animals, if he didn't implant this desire, this nature of a dog, we have wild dogs that are able to survive on their own, more or less, and we have domesticated animals. But the natures of these dogs are essentially the same, but their character kind of depends on their environment. But what causes a German Shepherd to be so devoted to their master? Well, it's how God has created them. So as we move from inanimate nature into the animate nature, one of my commentators calls this the mystery of instinct. And I love that. If you think about everything you read about these animals, essentially God is saying, I infuse this nature in these creatures. Okay, he says in Psalm 50, verses 10 and 11, For every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine. So all of creation is controlled and driven by his hand. So he begins with a lion, right? So he begins, can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait? Now, what we also want to see is the compare and contrast that God is obviously doing here. Right now, this is kind of moving into the rest of the animate nature that which we will consider. But he first brings up a lion, and then he brings up a raven. So recognize in this parallel situation, it is the great greatest of all the animals, it could be argued, and then kind of the least of all these animals. They have these fundraisers for certain animals. The polar bear gets these, and some dog pounds, need some funding to take care of these animals, zoos and so on. And, I've given a time or two to these causes and so on. But if they were asking money to save the extinction of ravens, I'm sorry, they're not getting a dime from me. Or mosquitoes? No, I think they can all burn a great fire and that'd be fun. But he begins with the lion. Now, the lion is spoken of throughout the Bible. We can think of Daniel and the lion's den. We can think of David and the lion. If we can remember even Samson tearing apart a lion. So many lions in the Bible. But Job himself says in chapter 10, verses 16 and 17, if my head is exalted, you hunt me like a fierce lion. And again, you show yourself awesome against me. You renew your witnesses against me and increase your indignation toward me. Changes in war are ever with me. He also says in Job 28, this is a chapter on wisdom, so much goes before this, but in verse 8, he says, the proud lions have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over. Remember, this is where he's kind of talking about, wisdom can't be found in the depths of the earth. But he's also saying, even the fierce lion, the great lion, knows nothing of this wisdom that is only given unto men and women, which only God holds in his hands, as it were. Wisdom only is found in God, and it only comes from his benevolent hand. It is a gift from God. It's nothing it's nothing for which you can dig into the earth and so on. Now, also, we know about the lion of the tribe of Judah, and I wanted to give a portion of that where Jacob is blessing his sons, and he says, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. Now, a lion's whelp is essentially the cubs. So in this verse where he says, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? God is essentially saying, even when we see these creatures, we like Animal Planet or something, we watch these things. This is much like going from these documentaries about the earth and so on. Wonderful thing, places we will likely never go and so on. And then to like Animal Planet, kind of a situation where there are certain depths of the seas that we can see in these documentaries that we would never be able to see otherwise. And that's wonderful. But when we see the lions hunting and so on, who is it that brings out the prey? If God controls it, essentially, if God has put this nature into these lions and has ordained them to hunt in such a manner, does he not do likewise with this prey? So he truly feeds the lion. The lion goes and crouches and hunts for his prey, but it's by God's providence, it's by God's gift that all these things are. Now let's move on to the raven, because what we also want to begin to get a glimpse is in why God's even bringing this up to Job. So who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food? Now, we considered with the inanimate nature how Christ commands us to consider the lilies of the field. He also, just before that, said to consider the ravens. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor weep, which have neither storehouse nor barn, and God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And I think when he moves from the raven to the lilies, he's taking from Job here. There are other places where I think he kind of takes from Job. But here he says, who provides food for the raven? Exactly what his son was getting at. When its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food. The raven won't really supply their young with food. It's, again, by the hand of God, these young ones are fed. The ravens have a hard enough time feeding themselves. And that's why the miracle of the ravens feeding Elijah is all the more a miracle, and they wouldn't really feed on meat. They would carry on every once in a while. This is flesh of dead animals, and they will on occasion, but they really don't tend to their young. By God's grace, these survive and these grow and these thrive. Now, I think what he's getting at as far as it parallels between the lion and the raven and mankind. Sometimes, men can be truly great. I think David was a lion of the tribe of Judah, a great warrior. But God is making it clear, even the great are only great by my providence, and even the least are the least by my providence, and I care for them both. They are both fed by my providence and my divine grace. And it's only by that. Again, yes, the raven will go out and fly for food. We like to go, we used to hunt and gather and so on. Now we hunt and gather in a store. But also, God is causing the cattle to roam the pastures in such a way before they're slaughtered so that they're ready for our nourishment and so on. So all of the wild, all of the earth is ordained and controlled by his divine providence. Let's continue. Do you know the time? So now we're going into chapter 39, where this is much longer. So I do want to mention that first verses 1 through 4 is its kind of own strophe, okay? And we will consider this, but then verses 5 through 12 goes into the donkey and the ox. And so these two are kind of a comparison. Much like the lion and the raven, the donkey will be and the ox. And then definitely the ostrich and the horse, even more so, the hawk and the eagle somewhat. But even here where he's talking about the wild goat and then the deer, and we'll get into this. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bear young? They bow down, they bring forth their young, they deliver their offspring. Their young ones are healthy, they grow strong with grain, they depart and do not return to them. Goats are an interesting thing. They've become kind of somewhat popular in our culture and in our time. My wife, Sarah, I'm just going to do that at least today. My wife, Sarah, wants the goat, wants us to have a goat right now. We have a decent sized backyard, but we still live in a neighborhood. So I don't know if that's going to go down. And I've never owned a goat, so I don't want to, try it out, with my neighbors surrounded and so on. So, I promised her, eventually I wouldn't mind fulfilling that dream of hers. But this is the ibex, the wild mountain goat. I don't know if you've seen these. This is amazing how high. I don't know if you've seen these. They go up and it's like these tiny little clefts that they're walking on. And then they'll just lie down and sleep up there. That's insane. It's insane. But they go high up. They go insanely high up. So he first compares that to the deer. Now, the deer is spoken of throughout the Bible many times, but really as an object of beauty and elegance. It's beautiful, and the way they run and the way they move. So one animal he's created to roam the wild and so on, who he will take care of, who he will feed. So these are undomesticated. So much like the shepherd or the tender of the flock and so on will watch for birth and so on, and wait for these months, know the time and so forth. Job doesn't, we don't know the time of the wild goats or the deer. They're roaming around. We have no idea. But by God's providence, these give young when it's time. However, so the ox will go high up by his providence. This is how he's made them. And the deer are made to leap around, dance around, kind of like a gazelle. It's the picture of a wild goat going into areas the deer won't go to, and then the deer frolicking around in places the wild goat won't go into. So these are a compare and contrast, but something, they're kind of akin to each other in some manner too. Because, so again, can you number the months that they fulfill, either the wild mountain goat or the deer? Or do you know the time when they bear young? They bow down, they bow down. That's a picture of really kind of putting yourself in a fetal position, when you're in so much pain and giving birth is like that. So they bow down. And it's kind of a picture though, when they're bowing down before their maker as they're procreating. It's a beautiful picture. They're bowing down before their maker as He's continuing this species through their offspring. They deliver their offsprings. Their young ones are healthy. They grow strong with grain. They depart and do not return to them. The young. But again, how are these things done? The wild goat, produces an offspring. The deer produce an offspring. Eventually, they grow to a certain age, and naturally, we don't see the deer say, okay, it's time for you to move out. It's not like the mountain goat is doing the same thing. They just know. There's something instinctive. There's something that God has given to them that makes these things so. So, again, wild goat going up into the mountains, as high as man can go. As high as man can go. And it's beautiful. And it's wonderful as the ways of mankind can be. I think the achievements of mankind are not to be diminished. I think we can achieve great things. I think we can move. and not me, but other people can dance really well and move really well with this sweet rhythm and choreographed and so on, where it's this really sweet deal. However, as high as these things, as high as we can get and so forth, and as elegant as we can get, we are still sustained and provided for by our divine Creator. So, even though we know the months that our young are born, we also, well, not us, but women also are somewhat forced to bow down when they give birth. If we can remember during the curse, this is kind of how the woman is saved. That's what Paul gets into by child rearing, but really through the birth of a child. This is kind of the curse. You're gonna suffer when you give birth, and so woman essentially bows down before her maker because God has made it this way. But again, it's a beautiful picture of a divine submission. It's a divine submission. Essentially, because of the fall, we're blinded to this, and yet because of the nature in which He has given us, even though we're fallen, yet He has made it to where we bow down to Him when it's rightfully time to bow to Him. They're young, so they deliver their offsprings. Their young ones are healthy. They grow strong with grain. God still feeds us and nourishes us. They depart and do not return. Still waiting for my sons to depart, and maybe every once in a while return. It's a joke. All right. Now, let's continue. Beginning at verse 5, I want to go all the way through verse 12 because, again, this is kind of a comparison between the two, and we have much to speak of here. Who set the wild donkey free? Who loosed the bonds of the onager, and whose home I have made the wilderness, and the barren land his dwelling? He scorns the tumult of the city. He does not heed the shouts of the driver. The range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes? Or will he plow the valleys behind you? Will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? Will you trust him to bring home your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? Now, again, in Job chapter 6, he says, from verse 5 through 7, does the wild donkey bray when it has grass, or does the ox low over its fodder? Can flavorless food be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? My soul refuses to touch them. They are as loathsome food to me. So what God is saying, what Job is saying, as he's crying out to God, is essentially that God is feeding him unsavory food. This food is disgusting. It doesn't suit my palate. It doesn't suit, because again, what he is doing is crying out to God on account of God's justice. Job is suffering, even though he is righteous. He doesn't deserve this. So he's crying out to God and essentially saying, you're feeding me with unsavory food. In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 3, he says, the ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know my people do not consider. In addition to, so what Isaiah says there, I think, is much of what God is saying to Job. So as Job is crying out to God and essentially saying that you are feeding me food I don't like. This is not right. I need savory food. I need to be fed with the bread which came from heaven. I'm starving for you. By this, so again, the ox and the goat know their master, they know their manger, they know their master's crib and so forth. Israel doesn't know. My people don't consider. As Job is crying out because of this terrible diet of seemingly judgment, but it's not judgment. Remember, it's refinement. But he's crying out, he's not yet understanding. It's still God who's feeding him even now through the suffering. This is part of his diet, which Job judged unsavory, and that makes sense, and God doesn't disagree with that. But again, just as Job brought up the ox and the donkey, so God is here, and he's essentially saying, so you complained about the food, kind of a thing, does the wild donkey bray when it has grass? Because again, God tends to the donkeys. Does the ox low over its fodder? Can flavorless food be eaten without salt, or is there any taste in the white of an egg? God says, who set the wild donkey free, or who loosed the bonds of the onager? The onager is just a swift donkey. It's just a species of donkey. Whose home I have made the wilderness and the barren land his dwelling. So, first of all, who sets either of these free? They don't just escape. He sets them free. He sets them free. The wild donkeys, as opposed to the domesticated donkeys, the wild donkeys are wild on account of God's liberation. God's liberation. And essentially, that's what he's showing to Job. Who has set you free, Job? Why are you a righteous man? Why are you blameless and upright, shunning evil and so on? Who has fed you this, Job? How have you become like this, Job? Who has liberated you to me? Who loosed the bonds and so forth? Whose home I have made the wilderness and the barren land his dwelling. So you're talking about the donkey and you're talking about the ox. I have made their home. I have made his tent the wilderness, the outskirts, the barren lands. Not so with you, Job, but right now that's where you are. But for these, this is their home. This is their home all the time. You had a great, prosperous situation, and now you're in the wilderness. Now you're in the desert for a time, but you complain with the donkey and the ox, and haven't you recognized that the donkey, the wild donkey anyway, I have made the wilderness his home. He scorns, I love this. The wild donkey scorns the tumult of the city. He does not heed the shouts of the driver. So he scorns the tumult of the city. Think about all the noise of the city, all the different things going about in the city. The wild donkey can't stand it. He doesn't want to be around it. And he does not heed the shouts of the driver. This is basically the herdsman of the goats. The ones who command these goats to do what they want them to do. The wild donkeys aren't listening to them by the provident hand of God. These are wild by him. He has loosed their bonds and so forth, so they're free, and so they won't listen to their master. But he has made them this way. He has not made us this way. So, certain similarities, but some stark differences. The range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches for every green thing. Again, he searches for the green thing that I have provided for him. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Now, this is the donkey, kind of a simpler animal, but strong enough to do many powerful things. And then ox, huge animal, huge beast. Will the ox be willing to serve you? Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? So the manger is essentially the feeding trough. If we can remember Jesus being born, having to rest in a manger. This is really the feeding trough. So will the wild ox be willing to serve you? This is not a domesticated ox. And so can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes? This is essentially around his horns. This is the strongest place of the ox. And so this is what they would do. However, can you do this, Job, with the wild ox? No, not with the wild ox. They cannot do this. It's much training. There's much that is involved in this. It's not like you go out into the wild and find a wild ox fully grown and bring that in. That's not happening. Okay, that's not happening. Or will he plow the valleys behind you? This is essentially the plowing rows, so to speak, before they would throw the seeds in there. Will you trust him because his strength is great? Right? If you can't control him, you can't trust him, even though he's so strong. Even though he's so strong, right? Or will you leave your labor to him? Again, this is the wild ox. I mean, this is like a bull in a china shop. You can't control him, so all he's going to do is likely just destroy everything you have. Will you trust him? Will you trust him to bring home your grain? I mean, he's not even going to gather the grain, and he's probably going to eat most of it and gather it to your threshing floor. Again, this is where you separate the wheat and the chaff. The wild ox will do no such thing. Now we go into the wild donkey again, who God has set free. Again, God has liberated mankind. There's a degree to which, again, even with all of these images, all of these pictures that God has given to us, they show forth that we are free in doing these things, but these are all provided by his benevolent providence. So the wild donkey, so to speak, is kind of our liberation. It can be seen somewhat as the certain freedom to do, God relents some of his grace and he essentially just allows us to do what we most greatly desire, as we've talked about. And so we're not puppets. We're not puppets. We are free agents. Remember, we talked about the difference between free will and probably the better term would be we're free moral agents. So that's one picture. And again, he's loosed the bonds. Now, whose home he's made the wilderness, I do think, are the fallen men and women. However, the range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. I think is pointing to the freedom that we have in Christ. Give us this day our daily bread. Christ is our daily portion. And so we seek out the pastures of his benevolence and his providence and his grace, and we feed upon the Son of God. And then the wild ox. Okay. Again, this is kind of similar to the lion. The fierceness and the greatness of a lion. Oh, we have a picture of a strong man. Think of somebody like a Samson. Now, I think this one kind of can go both ways, though. So essentially, I think this one can be a picture of us as we are to God. Sometimes we make it hard for him to rein us in, and he can't trust them to bring in his grain and so forth, or plow his valleys and so on, because we like to be wild on occasion. However, I think he's also pointing to Job and saying, think about me as the wild ox. Will the wild ox be willing to... Are you wanting me to serve you, Job? You're asking for this court case. You're pleading, and you're essentially on the brink of accusing me of injustice. Am I here to serve you? I sent my son to serve. Yes, but this is not the expectation that a humble dog, just like Hazel, this is why we illustrated this. This is not the way a true child of God acts. I don't expect my father to serve me. I certainly look to serve him. He is the greater. So, are you waiting for me to serve you? You expect me to bed by your manger? Is this what you expect me to just be at your beck and call? You are not my master. Can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes? Can you bind me? You're trying to bind me. You're trying to lasso me down to your level. Will you trust him because his strength is great? Is this the only reason you're trusting me? Is because I'm absolutely omnipotent and I have all the strength to move heaven and earth? Is this the only reason you're trusting me? It's much like the problem with evil. Remember we talked about, is it because God is willing to rid the earth of evil but just not able to? Or is he able and just unwilling? It's a false dilemma, and we talked about that. However, this is the deal, right? Is he able, but he's just unwilling? This is what Job is leaning toward, that he is able, he's just not doing it. But are you only trusting me because of my strength? Or will you leave your labor to him? Or will you trust him to bring home your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? Now, this is something that God does. He does provide for the just and the unjust, much less his servant, his son, Job. Now, we are going to conclude with this part because the remaining portion of the animals I'm very much looking forward to considering. The ostrich and the horse, read into these and look at the comparisons and consider the comparisons of how we've kind of considered the animals before. But I think these are two much greater contrasts, and he gets into far more detail. And so consider the differences between the ostrich and the horse and see where they also have their points of similarity and maybe what God is saying to us. Now again, Jesus Christ makes the point to consider the ravens and consider the lilies. Again, my wife Sarah and I love to be in nature. We love to be outside. That's why when we were considering Jonathan Edwards, I love to go out into nature and just consider his creation. But I love to study outside. I love to read. Remember, even the Puritans, they had two books, as it were. They had the Bible, they had the Word of God, and the book of nature. This is God's revelation. Remember, he has general revelation, he has special revelation that he gives to us. Okay? So, one of the unfortunate things about all the technology, which is very helpful, and I'm not, lamenting much other than its distractions. It's profound distractions. We're so belabored in our phones and on Instagram or the whatever social other apps. I'm not very familiar with these. I know about Instagram because my wife Sarah talks about it and will show me things from time to time, force me to watching certain things. Cars, games. It can be a number of things, but we're so distracted. We're so distracted with these things that we have made. And we don't really consider, sadly, as much as we ought. And as we're made to do what he's created, what he has made. And if you compare and contrast these things, even the coolest car, okay, I'm not good with these either, okay? So, Lamborghini, Bugatti, whatever, even those, don't compare to the lily of the field. That's where he says, consider the lily of the field, how it looks, how beautiful it is. Yet Solomon, in all of his splendor, wasn't arrayed like one of these. Even Solomon, even the greatest man, in the greatest of circumstances, isn't even as great as the lily of the field, as one simple lily. So, as we continue seeing what God has to say to Job, as we continue with these animals, let us see in this great relationship we can have with our domesticated animals. So let's see his divine nature even in that, but let us see his divine nature in all of his creation. But let us set our phones down for a moment. Let us park our cars for a moment. Let us put the game controllers down for a moment. And just look outside. Go outside and look around. Look around and stand in awe. And again, as David, who am I? What is man? You are mindful of him. Who am I? that you are mindful of me among all of your creation, not only the heavens and the earth, but these great beasts of the field who are yours. Yet you have exalted man to have dominion over all of this. What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you visit him. May we lift our eyes into the works of his fingers so that we can see more of who he is, that we might praise him all the more. Praise God. Let's pray.